He was 16 years old. His body was a prison, ravaged by a disease that marked him as an outcast, a curse from God. His kingdom, a sliver of Christian faith in a hostile land, was on the brink of annihilation. Before him, an unstoppable tide of steel and faith, the grand army of the legendary Sultan Saladin. The numbers were not just daunting, they were a death sentence. Fewer than 500 knights and a few thousand-foot soldiers against an invasion force that chroniclers, in their terror, swelled to over 26,000 men. His own advisors pleaded with him to hide, to seek the safety of stone walls and wait for the inevitable. Defeat was a certainty. But King Baldwin IV, the Leper King of Jerusalem, did not hide. He charged. This is the story of how a dying boy, in a single desperate gamble, achieved one of the most impossible victories in the history of war. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, a legacy of the First Crusade, was a fragile dream baking under the Levantine sun. By 1177, its long borders and thin garrisons were overseen by a tragic paradox: its king, Baldwin IV. Crowned at 13, Baldwin was a boy of sharp intellect and fierce spirit. But his tutor, William of Tyre, noticed something terrifying during a childhood game. As other boys cried out from pinches, Baldwin felt no pain. It was the first sign of leprosy. In the medieval world, this was a spiritual death sentence. Leprosy was seen as a divine punishment for sin, its decaying flesh a sign of inner corruption. The afflicted were cast out, their presence announced by a bell, a living spectre of God's wrath. The diagnosis should have forced Baldwin to abdicate, to vanish into the Order of St. Lazarus, a military order for knights with his affliction. The courts of Europe and the East buzzed with schemes. How could a king with numb hands wield a sword? But Baldwin refused to be a footnote. As the disease disfigured his face and crippled his limbs, his will became iron. He learned to control his warhorse with his knees alone, mastering the cavalryman's art even as sensation abandoned him. His bandaged hands were a stark sight, but beneath them was a razor-sharp mind and a courage that burned with a holy light. Even Muslim observers noted with surprise that the Franks, defying convention, kept their leper king in power. They saw what his own people saw, a spirit that refused to break. In 1177, that spirit faced its ultimate test. A storm had been gathering, a storm named Saladin. He was no mere warlord, but a brilliant Kurdish strategist who had united the fractured Muslim world under the banner of holy war. As Sultan of Egypt and Syria, he encircled Jerusalem, his goal absolute: to erase the Christian kingdom and reclaim the holy city for Islam. That autumn, Saladin saw his chance. The bulk of Jerusalem's army had been lured hundreds of miles north, leaving the kingdom dangerously exposed. Saladin mobilized his grand army in Egypt. Modern historians estimate a force of over 20,000 men, a river of steel pouring out of the Sinai. This was not a raid. This was an invasion to end it all. In November, his army crossed the border. The scale was overwhelming. He bypassed the Templar fortress at Gaza, his eyes fixed on Jerusalem. Panic rippled through the Christian lands. Saladin was confident the sick boy king would never face him in the open. Baldwin, with just 375 knights, raced to the coastal city of Ascalon to mount a defense. Saladin's army arrived, and with ease, pinned the young king and his tiny force inside the city. With the Christian king seemingly trapped, Saladin made a fateful, arrogant decision. He committed a classic military blunder. He underestimated his opponent. Leaving a small detachment to keep Baldwin bottled up, he turned the bulk of his army north towards Jerusalem, supremely confident the war was won. He allowed his troops to spread out, a sprawling mass that began to pillage the countryside. The towns of Ramla and Lydda were put to the torch. For Saladin, the campaign had become a victory tour. In Jerusalem, terror was absolute. But inside Ascalon, the Leper King was not defeated. He was waiting. Saladin's hubris had given him an opening. In a move of breathtaking audacity, Baldwin broke out of the city. He didn't flee. He did the unthinkable. He issued the Arrogance, a general call to arms, and sent a desperate message to the Knights Templar at Gaza. Their Grand Master, Odo de Saint-Amand, did not hesitate, racing to join the king with 80 of his elite knights. Baldwin's army was a patchwork force, knights, Templars, and farmers answering the call to defend their homes. Against Saladin's thousands, it was a pitifully small band. Any sane commander would have sought refuge. But Baldwin knew hiding would only delay the kingdom's death. He made a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble. His tiny army began to march, shadowing Saladin's larger force along the coast. He was hunting the hunter. Saladin remained blissfully unaware. His army, scattered for plunder, was dangerously overextended. His intelligence was non-existent. Having trapped Baldwin, he gave the boy king no further thought, failing to leave even a single scout to watch his rear. It was an elementary mistake, born of contempt, and it would cost him everything. Baldwin's force, guided by local lords who knew every fold of the land, moved with purpose, waiting for the moment when Saladin's greatest strength, his numbers, would become his greatest weakness. That moment came on November 25, 1177, near a mound the Franks called Montgisard. Here, Saladin's army was at its most vulnerable. They were disorganized, crossing difficult rain-soaked ground, their baggage train heavy with plunder, mired in mud. They were a sprawling, chaotic encampment, not an army ready for war. It was then that Baldwin chose to reveal himself. As the small Crusader army crested a rise, the sheer impossibility of their task must have stolen the breath from their lungs. What happened next would become legend. Baldwin, his body so ravaged he could barely stand, ordered the army to halt. He was helped from his horse. There, in full view of his men, the 16-year-old king fell to his knees in the mud. The Bishop of Bethlehem moved forward, raising high a golden reliquary, its surface glinting in the pale winter sun. Inside, a piece of wood, a relic of the true cross, believed to be the very timber upon which Christ was crucified. For these men, it was not a symbol, it was the physical presence of God. Baldwin prostrated himself before it, his bandaged hands reaching out in prayer, his voice crying out for victory. For the soldiers watching, the hardened knights, the zealous Templars, the terrified farmers, this was a transformative sight. Their king, marked by a disease seen as a curse, was demonstrating an act of profound, unshakable faith. His physical weakness was utterly eclipsed by an incredible spiritual strength. A wave of religious fervor, a raw and potent force, swept through the ranks. As he was helped to his feet, a roar went up from the tiny army. In that moment, they were not just soldiers, they were an instrument of divine will. Then, the order was given. The plan was brutally simple. A full-frontal, heavy cavalry charge aimed directly at the heart of Saladin's disorganized army. The charge began, led by the most feared warriors in the Christian world, the Knights Templar. 80 knights in their white mantles, a tide of armored faith, formed a spearhead that crashed into the Ayyubid lines with cataclysmic force. The impact was devastating. Saladin's troops, caught completely by surprise, had no time to form a proper battle line. The disciplined weight of the Frankish charge shattered their ranks, sowing chaos and panic. Saladin's nephew, Taqi al-Din, was killed in the opening moments. Saladin frantically tried to rally his personal bodyguard of 1,000 elite Mamluk warriors, but it was too late. The Crusader charge, seemingly unstoppable, smashed into them as well, a wave of steel breaking upon a disordered shore. The battle descended into a complete rout. Saladin's men, moments before confident conquerors, now broke and fled, casting aside their weapons, their only thought to escape the slaughter. The great Sultan himself, nearly captured, was forced to flee for his life, escaping the carnage on a swift racing camel with only a handful of bodyguards. The victory was so absolute that the Crusaders captured Saladin's entire baggage train, seizing his army's treasury. The Battle of Montgisard wasn't just a victory, it was an annihilation. The pursuit lasted for miles, well into the night. Those who escaped were hunted down by local Christian settlers hungry for revenge. Saladin's retreat to Egypt was a week-long nightmare of heavy rains and harassing Bedouin tribesmen. By the time he reached Cairo, some accounts say he had only a tenth of the men he had led out with such confidence. It was a humiliation so profound that Muslim historians would later write that the defeat was only truly redeemed a decade later by his great victory at Hattin. For the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the victory was a miracle, but it came at a high price. While their losses were small compared to Saladin's, they were still heavy for such a small army, with some sources claiming over 1,000 killed and hundreds more wounded. To commemorate the day, Baldwin erected a Benedictine monastery on the battlefield, dedicated to Saint Catherine of Alexandria, on whose feast day the battle was fought. The victory at Montgisard brought the kingdom a desperately needed decade of relative peace and cemented the legend of Baldwin IV. He was no longer just the Leper King, a figure of pity. He was a warrior king, a hero who had faced down impossible odds and through sheer force of will had triumphed. But the legacy of Montgisard is a tragic paradox. For Saladin, it was a harsh but invaluable lesson. He would never again show such contempt for his Frankish opponents. His future campaigns would be marked by caution and meticulous planning. For the Christian West, however, the miracle had the opposite effect. It bred a dangerous complacency. The victory was seen as a sign of God's favor, proof that the kingdom was divinely protected. Baldwin's later frantic appeals for a new crusade fell on deaf ears in Europe. No one understood how precarious the kingdom's existence truly was until it was too late. Baldwin IV died in 1185 at just 24 years old. His death unleashed the very infighting he had struggled to contain, leading directly to the kingdom's catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 and the fall of Jerusalem to a wiser, more patient Saladin. The story of Montgisard is the story of how, for one glorious day, a dying teenage king, leading a handful of knights and a prayer, stared down the most powerful ruler of his age and made the impossible happen. Its memory lives on, an echo in history books and films like Kingdom of Heaven, a testament to the idea that courage, not the body, is the true measure of a king. The legend of the Leper King reminds us that history is often shaped not by the strongest armies, but by the strongest wills. His defiance created a story that has inspired people for over 800 years. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's most incredible underdog victories, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories that bring the past to life. Let us know in the comments, what other impossible battles or forgotten heroes should we cover next? Thank you for watching.